Hi guys, we're going to go ahead and start the study of the brain, which has more to do with the central nervous system as opposed to the peripheral nervous system that you learned about before. So just real quickly, kind of a side note, is which type of neuron. We learned what a neuron is before, but which type of neuron lies completely within the central nervous system? That's called an inter, which kind of makes sense, because it's in between. So the interneuron, and we learned that there were other ones, so it's not, we learned about the sensory. It's not the sensory or the motor. So do not confuse those. We're specifically talking about interneurons. Okay, so kind of talking about how the brain develops. So the central nervous system is actually established with the first month of development in the womb. And then gender-specific areas, so male, female, they are present, and they're present in both the brain and the spinal cord. So maternal exposure to things like, it could be radiation is one thing, drugs is obviously another one, alcohol is probably one that you've heard of before as having an effect. Those all can harm the developing central nervous system in the brain. So also something else you've probably heard about is smoking, and how it affects brain development. So smoking decreases the amount of oxygen in the blood, and so that can lead to those neurons dying, so neuron death, and probably have heard of this, fetal brain damage, like fetal alcohol syndrome. So the neuromuscular coordination, that progresses, so in other words, it grows, and this goes back to what we learned probably first quarter. So superior to inferior. So remember, superior means on top, inferior means below. So that coordination starts at the brain and moves down from there. And then proximal, that is, into your distal. So starting more at your core and then going out and moving to your appendages. So developmental aspects of it. So obviously old age. So age does bring some cognitive or brain declines, but they're not significant until usually when people reach their 80s. And some people tend to think it's kind of the opposite, or that it happens way sooner, but it actually doesn't significantly decline until about the age of 80. So the brain does shrink. So it shrinks the older you get, so in old age. But then also the excessive use of alcohol, that can cause what they call signs of senility, which just basically means signs of senility. So kind of how aware you are, and it's kind of used of senile, whether or not you're crazy is what some people kind of refer that as. But excessive use of alcohol can lead to the signs of a decline in cognitive abilities, but it doesn't have anything to do with old age. So moving on here. So how the body protects the central nervous system. So the bone, we learned about that before. So which we call the cranium. And then there's the vertebrae. Okay, so that's one way that the body protects the central nervous system. And then meninges, that's a fancy way of saying a membrane. So those are membranes between the bone and soft tissue of the nervous system. Okay, so just remember, kind of starts with an M, and this starts with an M, so the meninges are membranes. The dura mater, what they call most, fancy way of saying this, is that it's most superficial. So think about what that means. Superficial means it's closer to the outside. And then the arachnoid mater is the middle portion. And then the pia mater, some people call it pia, that's the deepest layer. And I'll show you a picture in the next slide. The cerebrospinal fluid, if it's a fluid, you know that it is a watery sort of cushion between that arachnoid mater and the pia mater. And I'll show you in a sec what that looks like. So the blood-brain barrier is something else which I think is really interesting. So it's kind of like a security system. So it's a filter, sort of a filter mechanism. It carries blood to the brain and spinal cord tissue, but it also blocks, which is interesting. It blocks passage of certain substances. So it is a security system. So it's very effective in keeping certain things out of the brain that don't need to be there, but it could be potentially too effective because it also prevents drugs from being able, drugs that would be able to repair an injured or diseased brain, they can't make their way into the brain. It is easier to move certain substances, so things that would be easier to move, those are like antidepressants, that's something that's easily moved. Alcohol is another one. Alcohol is easy to move. Cocaine, those certain types of drugs are easy to reach the brain, but things that are larger or harder, more difficult to move, would be things like glucose. And another big one that's important is insulin. So, you know, the blood-brain barrier, like I said, it's a filter, it's a security system that allows things to pass or not pass, but when the barrier becomes sort of broken or maybe leaky, is a unscientific word for it, but if it is leaky, then the blood-brain barrier becomes leaky. That means, for example, too many white blood cells, for example, could enter, and that is the main cause of multiple sclerosis, which is a disease you may have heard of before. So that blood-brain barrier, just think of that as a filter, that security system. It blocks certain things from coming in, but because of that, it also could be potentially a bad thing if you're wanting to repair the brain. So going back to what I'd said before, so how it's protected. So think of this as, okay, here's your scalp, here's the periosteum, there's the actual cranium, the bone of the skull, and then here's those three things that I mentioned before. So the dura mater is superficial, so it's closest to the bone. The arachnoid mater is in between, and the pia mater is closer to the blood vessel. And these, I don't think I'll give you you don't really need to know that. Just kind of have a picture of what this looks like from top to bottom. Okay. Now all of these imbalances of the brain, I'm not going to specifically mention what these are right now, but I do want you to do some independent research on these to make sure you understand what they each do and sort of the symptoms of them. So the regions of the brain, one, and some of these you may have heard before, they at least sound kind of familiar. The cerebrum is one, so the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe, we'll talk about what each one of those do, but those are all part of the cerebrum. And then diencephalon, those things includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, which I don't think we'll talk about that one, just these main three ones. So that's diencephalon, the cerebellum, and then the brainstem is the other one. So there's 4 major regions. 1, the cerebrum, 2, the diencephalon, 3, the cerebellum, and 4, the brainstem. Important thing here, so what part of the central nervous system provides that two-way communication with the peripheral nervous system that allows things to go back and forth between the two? That is the spinal cord. Okay, so the cerebrum, the first one we'll talk about, is, let's see, so number 1, it's cutting off. There we go. Okay, so the cerebrum, so the hemispheres, those are superficial, so remember what that means, part of the brain. So the external part of the brain. So there's different lobes. The frontal lobe, that's your, what else? Your planning, processing new things, so making new memories, or like processing new memories, I could say. Processing new memories. And also personality. That's another one. And some studies have shown that the frontal lobe, especially in boys or teenage boys, isn't actually fully developed until their 20s. So that judgment can be impaired or not fully functioning or fully, I guess we could say fully developed until they reach their 20s. So that's the frontal, deals with judgment, planning, things like that. Parietal, that's more of your math, like mathematical reasoning. And another thing that's interesting is that that's the part that's responsible for recognizing faces. I'm real bad about recognizing faces. But anyway, that's the parietal lobe. The temporal, that deals strictly with hearing, and occipital deals strictly with vision. So those are all the lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, and just to kind of give you an idea of the regions, here's the different lobes. I'm not going to ask you to label these, but just to kind of give you an idea of what's at the front. Obviously, it's the frontal lobe and the occipital, so your ability to see is actually located in the back of the brain, not in the front. And the ridges, and you can kind of see here what those ridges look like. It's what they call gyri. And sort of gyri, or the amount of the gyri that's present in a brain, is related to intelligence. So you can see like mammals like dolphins and humans have a lot of those gyri, those convolutions or like wrinkles in the brain, whereas we'll say dumber animals like mice and also things like manatees, pretty not smart, I'll say. So intelligence wise, they have a fairly smooth brain as opposed to a convoluted or wrinkled brain. So those ridges are called the gyri. Okay, so before I go ahead and start the cerebrum, I'll go ahead and stop and give you guys time to kind of get to your notes right now, but we'll continue on with the cerebrum with the next video.